Hello, hello, and welcome back to another day of language. I know it feels strange to be on a screen again. Hopefully this isn't for too long, but that's what I said last time as well, last year. So I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed that we can all be back together in just about a week. So that's what we know, is that it has to be, we're all in this quarantine for a little bit, but it's not necessarily permanent. And so yeah, we'll just do what we got to do to get by. Some days I'm going to be making these videos for you like old times, and other times I'll just give you instructions on what to do. And then other times we will have a live meeting when I think that it is appropriate. And I will give you a little heads up at least by scheduling those the night before in case you need to attend them the day of. And we'll just see how it goes from there and kind of adjust as we need to going forward. But today I want to finish off the Sherlock Holmes story that we had started last week and go through some questions with you as well. And I'm going to pick it up at about page 102 at the bottom. So we probably got to page 99 or 100 when we were in class. So I want you to read a couple pages before you go on with this video. So this is where you could pause and get up to page 102 and then continue reading with me once we're there. But basically, if you have read that section so far, what you found is that Sherlock cracks the code. And we don't need to get into details about how he does that. But he starts by saying, well, the most popular letter in the English alphabet is E, so I'm going to start plugging that in and trying to find out. I'm going to plug that into the most common characters drawn and then use that as a way of unlocking more letters. So you can imagine at first it's just a bunch of dancing men. Then you plug in E because it's the most common, take a shot at the most common character. Well, now you have still a mystery, but it's less of a mystery because there's more uncovered. He then makes the case that, well, this may be a name. It's a 5-letter word. It has an E in the second spot and then the fourth spot. And there's only so many words that have that combination of E's. And he says, well, sever would be one, but that's not a very common word. And then he said, what if the two E's had to do with Elsie? And that would make more sense. So he goes through this whole process. Once he unlocks one letter, then he can figure out one word. Once he unlocks one word, then that opens up a lot more letters to plug in to different spots in other words and other sentences. And pretty soon he has the whole alphabet uncovered with all these dancing men. So here's what the notes actually were saying in the story. Some of you had them written in your book, unfortunately, but others of you, this will be a big reveal. So some of the first notes that he wrote were, am here, Abe Slaney. I almost called him C.S. Lewis. Not C.S. Lewis, but Sherlock Holmes then goes to the police bureau, the police officers, to see, do you guys know who this Abe Slaney is? And they said, well, let me check. Oh, yes, he's one of America's most wanted criminals. And he's involved with all these gangs as well. So he's a pretty wanted man, and meaning he's infamous for all of his criminal activity in America, and they even know about him in England. That's the person that's associated with her. Perhaps that's the one that she's been trying to cover up from the beginning of the story when she said, don't ask me about my past. Anyways, Abe Slaney is the one writing the note. Am here, Abe Slaney. Next we have a mysterious little note, A. Elries, with a couple blanks. You can see that at the bottom of page 100 if you were following along. And he plugs in that to mean at Elridge's. And then, of course, he asked around to the different servants, do you guys know what Elridge's is? And nobody really knew at first, but then the farm boy says, "Oh, I know Elridge's. There's an Elridge's farm not too far from here, and it's a very lonesome place." That seems to be where he was hiding out, and fleeing from the police. We will recall then that Sherlock Holmes sends a letter to Elridge's farm in the handwriting of someone else. We could concur that he is impersonating someone else's handwriting for some reason, and that's where he sends the letter. Maybe you can kind of deduce what he was doing in trying to send that letter and what his plan was. Certainly in a page or two that'll become clear. But that's what we've heard. That's what we've unlocked so far. And then there was one more very disturbing note written in the Dancing Men letters, and this is the last thing that Cubitt sent off before he died. And this is interpreted by Sherlock to mean, "Elsie, prepare to meet thy God." Yikes. Prepare to meet thy God, as in prepare to die. That is kind of the threat. So all of these invitations for her to come be with him have turned into threats, and it really escalated from there. But let's pick it up now at page 102. There's this exchange where Sherlock says, "We don't need to go find him because he's going to come to us." The inspector and Watson are totally confused by that. They said, "What do you mean he's going to come to us? He's a criminal. Why would he do that?" But Sherlock seems to know something that they don't. Let's pick it up at the bottom of 102. "We waited in silence for a minute, one of those minutes which one can never forget. Then the door opened and the man stepped in. In an instant, Holmes clapped a pistol to his head and Martin slipped the handcuffs over his wrists. It was all done so swiftly and deftly that the fellow was helpless before he knew he was attacked. He glared from one to the other of us with a pair of blazing black eyes. Then he burst into a bitter laugh. 'Well, gentlemen, you have the drop on me this time. I seem to have knocked up against something hard, but I came here in answer to a letter from Mrs. Hilton Cubitt. Don't tell me that she is in this? Don't tell me that she helped set a trap for me? Mrs. Hilton Cubitt was seriously injured, and is at death's door.' The man gave a hoarse cry of grief, which rang through the house. 'You're crazy!' he cried fiercely. 'It was he that was hurt, not she. Who would have hurt little Elsie? I may have threatened her, God forgive me, but I would have not touched a hair of her pretty head. Take it back, you. Say that she is not hurt.' She was found badly wounded by the side of her dead husband. He sank with a deep groan on the settee and buried his face in his manacled hands. For 5 minutes he was silent. Then he raised his face once more and spoke with the cold composure of despair. 'I have nothing to hide from you, gentlemen,' said he. 'If I shot the man, he had his shot at me, and there's no murder in that. But if you think I could have hurt that woman, then you don't know either me or her. I tell you, there was never a man in this world loved a woman more than I loved her. I had a right to her. She was pledged to me years ago. Who is this Englishman that he should come between us? I tell you that I had the first right to her, and that I was only claiming my own. She broke away from your influence when she found the man that you are,' said Holmes sternly. 'She fled from America to avoid you, and she married an honorable gentleman in England. You dogged her and followed her, and made her life a misery to her, in order to induce her to abandon the husband whom she loved and respected, in order to fly with you, whom she feared and hated. You have ended by bringing about the death of a noble man, and driving his wife to suicide. That is your record in this business, Mr. Abe Slaney, and you will answer for it to the law.' 'If Elsie dies, I care nothing of what becomes of me,' said the American. He opened one of his hands and looked at a note crumpled up in his palm. 'See here, mister,' he cried, with a gleam of suspicion in his eyes. 'You're not trying to scare me over this, are you? If the lady is hurt as bad as you say, who was it that wrote this note?' He tossed it forward onto the table. 'I wrote it, to bring you here.' 'You wrote it? There was no one on earth outside the joint who knew the secret of the Dancing Men. How came you to write it? What one man can invent, another can discover. said Holmes. It's a great line, by the way. "There is a cab coming to convey you to Norwich, Mr. Slaney, but meanwhile you have time to make some small reparation for the injury you have wrought. Are you aware that Mrs. Hilton Cubitt has herself lain under grave suspicion of the murder of her husband, and that it was only my presence here, and the knowledge which I happen to possess, which has saved her from this accusation? The least that you owe her is to make it clear to the whole world that she was in no way, directly or indirectly, responsible for this tragic end." "I ask nothing better," said the American. "I guess the very best case I can make for myself is the absolute naked truth." "It is my duty to warn you that it will be used against you," cried the inspector, with the magnificent fair play of the British criminal law. Slaney shrugged his shoulders. "I'll chance that," said he. "First of all, I want to give you gentlemen to understand that I have known this lady since she was a child. There were 7 of us in a gang in Chicago, and Elsie's father was the boss of the joint. He was a clever man, was old Patrick. It was he who invented that writing, which would pass as a child's scrawl unless you just happened to have the key to it. Well, Elsie learned some of our ways, but she couldn't stand the business, and she had a bit of honest money of her own, so she gave us all the slip and got away to London. She had been engaged to me, and she would have married me, I believe, if I had taken over another profession, but she would have nothing to do with anything on the cross. It was only after her marriage to this Englishman that I was able to find out where she was. I wrote to her, but got no answer. After that I came over, and as letters were no use, I put my messages where she could read them. Well, I have been here a month now. I lived in that farm where I had a room down below, and could get in and out every night, and no one the wiser. I tried all I could to coax Elsie away. I knew that she read the messages, for once she wrote an answer under one of them. Then my temper got the better of me, and I began to threaten her. She sent me a letter then, imploring me to go away, and saying that it would break her heart if any scandal should come upon her husband. She said that she would come down when her husband was asleep at 3 a.m. and speak with me through the end window, if I would go away afterwards and leave her in peace. She came down and brought money with her, trying to bribe me to go. This made me mad, and I caught her arm and tried to pull her through the window. At that moment in rushed the husband with his revolver in his hand. Elsie had sunk down upon the floor, and we were face to face. I held up my gun to scare him off and let me get away. He fired and missed me. I fired off almost at the same instant, and down he dropped. I made away across the garden, and as I went I heard the window shut behind me. That's God's truth, gentlemen, every word of it, and I heard no more about it until the lad came riding up with a note which made me walk in here and give myself into your hands. A cab had driven up whilst the American had been talking. 2 uniformed policemen sat inside. Inspector Martin rose and touched his prisoner on the shoulder. "It is time for us to go." "Can I see her first?" "No, she is not conscious. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I only hope that if ever again I have an important case, I shall have the good fortune to have you by my side." We stood at the window and watched the cab drive away. As I turned back, my eye caught the pellet of paper which the prisoner had tossed upon the table. It was the note with which Mr. Holmes had decoyed him. "See if you can read it, Watson," said he with a smile. It contained no word but this little line of dancing men. "If you use the code which I have explained," said Holmes, "you will find that it simply means 'come here at once.'" I was convinced that it was an invitation which he could not refuse, since he could never imagine that it could come from anyone but the lady. And so, my dear Watson, we have ended by turning the dancing men to good when they have so often been the agents of evil, and I think that I have fulfilled my promise of giving you something unusual for your notebook. 3:40 is our train, and I fancy we should be back in Baker Street for dinner. Only one word of epilogue. The American Abe Slaney was condemned to death at the winter of Assizes in Norwich, but his penalty was changed to penal servitude in consideration of mitigating circumstances and certainty that Hilton Cubitt had fired the first shot. Of Mrs. Hilton Cubitt, I only know that I have heard she recovered entirely, and that she still remains a widow, devoting her whole life to care of the poor and to the administration of her husband's estate. And there you have it, the adventure of the dancing men. So this is how it unravels at the very end. We have this mysterious figure who we didn't really know, except for vague references to him, Mr. Abe Slaney, that arrives on the scene. Now, they didn't even have to go find him. He just arrives because Mr. Holmes had sent his letter in the handwriting and the Dancing Men script of Mrs. Cubitt, expecting that, and he was expecting that he would find her. Now, that means that he did not shoot Mrs. Cubitt, that Mrs. Cubitt was the one who had actually shut the window. That's why they found the window closed when they went to the crime scene. She was the one that shut the window, and then in her grief at seeing the dead Mr. Cubitt, shot herself in the brain, but not fatally. It is said that she recovered as well at the very end, so that's a happy ending, but still a pretty tragic crime that was committed. We also get more insight into this Abe Slaney character who is the villain, is the antagonist of the detective, who's working in the shadows this whole story. But I'm curious if you had any sympathy for the guy. Yeah, he's a murderer. And that's kind of first and foremost why he is the villain. But think about the story. There's kind of this backstory, this love story that seems to be happening at the same time. And there's a few questions on here that ask you to reflect on that. So page 103. What is Slaney's rationale for his actions towards Elsie? Think about that before you write it down. They mention this in the next question. They mention the joint, and that's referenced twice by Abe Slaney. And he says that Elsie's father was the one at the head of the joint. So you can get a clear idea of what that means by putting two and two together about their organization. And then finally on 24, we have where do the individual words end in the Dancing Men cipher? With what part of the picture? So that goes back to how some of the characters have the flag up in the right hand. That indicates that it's the end of the word and a new word is starting. I think that's what they're getting at with those dancing men there. There is one more question on the back. Sorry, I almost skipped over that. Page 107. From the last line, infer what happened for the rest of Mrs. Cubitt's life. Write at least 3 examples or descriptions of her life. So again, here's the last line. It says, of Mrs. Hilton Cubitt, I only know that I have heard she recovered entirely, and that she still remains a widow, devoting her whole life to the care of the poor and to the administration of her husband's estate. So think about what you know about Elsie and try to infer, meaning reason out, at least 3 examples or descriptions of what she did with her life, what she got into, and how she lived. What sort of people did she care for besides the poor? Do you think she reached out with people involved in gang violence, or do you think she would run away as far from them as she could? Maybe she helped out with homeless people or charities, depending on the type of character that she had shown before. But that's really up to your conjecture. So I'll let you decide that. I'd like you to finish off these questions for our next discussion. And I look forward to hearing what you thought of the final end, what questions remain with you about this story, how rewarding it was for you to figure out that mystery, that puzzle, because we will be starting a new mystery no later than tomorrow, our second Sherlock Holmes mystery. And I really think you'll enjoy this one as well. If you want to look ahead at that one, it's going to be called The Speckled Band. The Speckled Band. So that is exciting. I'm hitting about 20-minute mark. That'll be enough for our class today. And I hope to see you soon.